For over 1,000 years, the most educated doctors in Europe diagnosed illness by staring at a flask of urine, consulting the position of Jupiter, and then confidently draining a quarter of the patient's blood into a copper bowl. They weren't guessing. They had university degrees, peer-reviewed textbooks, and a theoretical framework so internally consistent that it convinced generation after generation of brilliant men that they were saving lives. They were not. Tonight, we're stepping into the sick room of medieval Europe, where a scratchy throat wasn't just a symptom. It was a moral verdict from God, a financial catastrophe that could bankrupt a family for 3 generations, and a bureaucratic ordeal involving astrologers, scribes, and a priest who needed to hear your darkest sins before anyone would hand you a cup of willow bark tea. Grab a blanket. Settle in. And whatever you do, don't breathe too deeply, because the iron taste of the bloodletting bowl is just the beginning. Here is something unremarkable that happened this morning, somewhere in the world. Someone woke up with a sore throat. They shuffled to the bathroom, opened a cabinet, and swallowed a small white pill that was engineered by thousands of chemists, tested across decades of clinical trials, manufactured on a sterile production line in a facility they will never visit, and delivered to a shop 3 minutes from their house. Within 40 minutes, the pain dimmed. They went to work. They forgot about it by lunch. That small white pill represents the end point of a chain of knowledge so vast and so painstakingly assembled that no single human mind can hold it all at once. And for nearly the entire span of recorded history, it did not exist. In medieval Europe, the sore throat didn't go away by lunch. It got worse by supper. And by the following morning, it had become the opening act of something far larger than a physical inconvenience. Illness in the medieval world was not simply a matter of the body failing. It was a message. A divine communique delivered through aching joints, rising fever, and the slow, creeping terror of not knowing whether this was the sickness that would kill you, bankrupt your family, or both. Before a physician would even glance in the patient's direction, a priest needed to arrive first. Not as a kindness, as policy. The Fourth Lateran Council had made it perfectly clear. The soul came before the body, and if someone died mid-treatment without having confessed their sins, well, that was a problem for the physician's conscience and the patient's eternal soul. So the first responder to a medieval illness was not a doctor. It was a man in robes asking whether anyone had committed adultery recently. After the priest came the physician, if the family could afford one. He would examine a flask of urine held up to candlelight, consult a chart of planetary alignments, and dictate his findings to a scribe who charged by the word. He would rarely touch the patient. He didn't need to. He had a system. And that system, the system of humoral medicine, was not the fumbling ignorance of people who didn't know better. It was a sophisticated, university-backed, logically consistent framework that confidently made almost everything worse. It was wrong the way a beautiful building can be wrong, structurally, all the way down to the foundation, but with such elegant architecture that nobody thinks to check. That is the story tonight. Not the story of ignorance. The story of certainty. And why it tastes, very faintly, of iron. The room is small. The ceiling is low. The fire has gone to embers sometime in the last 2 hours, and the air holds that particular damp chill that seeps into wool blankets and stays there, patient as a creditor. Somewhere around the year 1350, in a middling town in England or France or the Low Countries, a man wakes up and something is wrong. His joints ache with a deep, wet heaviness, as though someone has poured cold water into the spaces between his bones. His throat feels raw, scraped, as if he swallowed a handful of straw in his sleep. The linen shirt plastered to his chest has gone clammy with dried sweat, and the straw mattress beneath him gives off that familiar smell of must and old grain and something faintly animal. He sits up. The room tilts, just slightly. Through the shuttered window, he can hear the street coming alive. A cart. A dog. A woman shouting something about the price of bread. The taste in his mouth is stale beer and something metallic, like licking a coin. There is no thermometer. There is no blood pressure cuff. There is no framework for understanding what is happening inside his body that would be recognizable to a modern mind. What there is, instead, is a vast and terrifying uncertainty, because in medieval Europe, there was no clear boundary between a passing chill and a death sentence. The common cold and the plague could start with the same shiver. A headache could be nothing. A headache could be everything. And so the questions begin. His wife, if he has one, presses a hand to his forehead and frowns. A neighbor leans in the doorway and suggests it's the damp air. Another neighbor suggests it's the fish from Tuesday. His mother-in-law suggests, with the quiet confidence of a woman who has seen things, that he probably angered someone at the market, and this is the result. But beneath the folk theories and the neighbor's suspicion of Tuesday's fish, there runs a deeper current, a theological one. Because in the medieval worldview, illness was not random. It was not mechanical. It was a communication from God. It was a correction, a punishment, a test, or occasionally a mark of special spiritual attention, the way a saint might suffer to demonstrate holiness. Either way, the body's failure pointed upward, toward heaven, and the first question a sick person had to answer was not what is wrong with me, but what have I done? That question hung in the damp air of every sick room. It clung to the wool blankets. It tasted like guilt. And it meant that the first visitor would not carry medicine. He would carry a Bible. The priest arrived first, and this was not negotiable. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council issued a decree that still echoes through the corridors of medical history. Physicians were instructed, in terms both firm and slightly threatening, that the soul must be treated before the body. If a patient died during treatment without having made a proper confession, the physician bore a share of the spiritual responsibility. So before any remedy was attempted, before any herb was crushed or any broth was warmed, a man in clerical vestments sat at the bedside and asked the patient to account for their sins. This was, from a pastoral perspective, entirely reasonable. From a medical perspective, it meant that the sickest patients, the ones who needed help most urgently, were first subjected to an extended spiritual interview while their fever climbed. The priest was gentle. The priest was thorough. The priest was not in a rush. And the patient, sweating through their linen, confessed to whatever needed confessing while their body quietly continued to deteriorate. Once the soul was tended, the community stepped in. And here, the medieval medical system revealed something unexpectedly warm. The first real caregivers were almost always women. Wives, mothers, sisters, neighbors, the informal network of women who appeared at doorways with covered pots and firm opinions. They brought herbal broths, barley water, honey poultices, and the kind of steady, unsentimental competence that comes from having nursed a dozen people through a dozen illnesses with no instruction manual. Some of their remedies, by pure empirical luck or inherited wisdom, actually worked. Willow bark tea contained salicin, a compound that would eventually be refined into aspirin. Honey poultices had genuine antibacterial properties. Certain bread molds, applied to wounds with hopeful faith and no understanding of why, occasionally fought infection through the same mechanism that would one day be called penicillin. Other remedies were less effective. A pigeon split in half and applied warm to the feet was believed to draw fever downward out of the body. Ground pearls dissolved in wine were prescribed for ailments of the heart. A live frog held against an abscessed tooth was supposed to absorb the pain. The frog, one imagines, disagreed. Beyond the neighbors stood the cunning folk, the wise women and local healers whose practice blended herbalism with charms, prayers, and a touch of what the church would nervously call something close to magic. They prescribed remedies with incantations. They hung amulets. They read signs in smoke and water. And they served as the primary medical practitioners for the vast majority of medieval people, because the vast majority of medieval people would never, in their entire lives, see a university-trained physician. The physician was a luxury, a very expensive luxury. For most families, the priest, the neighbor with the broth, and the cunning woman with the herbs and the charms were the entire healthcare system. And honestly, given what the physician was about to do, they might have been better off. If a family had enough money, enough status, or enough desperation, the physician eventually arrived. He came wearing robes, often fur-trimmed, carrying an air of academic authority, and, crucially, a round-bottomed glass flask called a matula. This flask was the stethoscope of medieval medicine. It was the physician's primary diagnostic instrument, and it was, upon arrival, expected to be full of the patient's urine. Horoscopy, the art of reading urine, was the cornerstone of medieval diagnosis. The process was ritualized to a degree that would impress a sommelier. The urine had to be collected first thing in the morning, ideally the full quantity, and transported to the physician in the matula without being shaken, heated, or exposed to direct sunlight. The journey from bedside to consulting room was treated with the solemnity of a diplomatic envoy carrying a treaty. Once the flask arrived, the physician held it up to the light. He swirled it, slowly, observing how the liquid moved, how it caught the glow of a candle or the gray afternoon filtering through a window. He noted the color, which could range across more than 20 recognized gradations, from pale straw to gold to amber to ruddy brown to an alarming greenish-black that was, as one might guess, not a good sign. He examined the sediment. He assessed the consistency, whether it was thin as water or thick as syrup. He noted whether it foamed when agitated. He smelled it. And sometimes, because the medieval physician was nothing if not committed to his craft, he tasted it. A sweetness on the tongue suggested one imbalance. A bitterness suggested another. The flavor profile of human urine, it turns out, was a diagnostic language, and the physician was fluent. This was not quackery performed in a back alley. This was taught at the finest universities in Europe, from Salerno to Montpellier to Paris. Entire textbooks were devoted to uroscopy, complete with illustrated color wheels showing which shade of amber indicated an excess of yellow bile and which shade of cloudy white pointed to a phlegmatic crisis. The system had rigor. It had nuance. It had peer review. And it told the physician almost nothing accurate about what was actually wrong with the patient. But the urine flask was only the beginning. The physician also took the patient's pulse, which was not measured in beats per minute, but interpreted through an elaborate system mapped to musical rhythms. A pulse could be described as leaping or creeping or undulating like a worm, each pattern corresponding to a specific humoral imbalance. Then came the stars. Astrological medicine was not a fringe interest. It was mandatory curriculum. The physician consulted the patient's birth chart and the current planetary alignments before prescribing treatment. Certain procedures, bloodletting in particular, were forbidden when the moon was in the wrong sign. A surgery performed when Mars was in the ascendant was considered reckless. The zodiac was mapped onto the body. Aries governed the head, Pisces the feet, and performing an operation on a body part while its ruling sign was active was considered as dangerous as operating drunk. Through all of this, the physician maintained a careful physical distance from the patient. He did not palpate the abdomen. He did not peer into the throat. He did not press his ear to the chest. He had the urine, the pulse, the stars, and the patient's spoken account of symptoms, which he dictated to a scribe who sat in a corner, recording every observation onto parchment. The scribe, it should be noted, charged by the word. So the more thorough the diagnosis, the more expensive the record. The physician's eloquence was, quite literally, a billable event. And after all this, the physician rendered his verdict. He named the imbalance. He prescribed the treatment. And then he left, because the actual physical work of medicine, the cutting, the bleeding, the cauterizing, that was beneath him. That was someone else's job entirely. The system that governed all of this, the invisible architecture behind every urine flask and every planetary chart, was humoral theory. And to understand why medieval medicine was so confidently, so persistently, so elegantly wrong, one has to understand just how right it felt from the inside. The theory was ancient. It stretched back to Hippocrates in the 5th century before the Common Era, was refined by Galen in the 2nd century, and was further elaborated by the Persian physician Avicenna in the 11th century, whose canon of medicine became the dominant medical textbook in European universities for the next 500 years. The core idea was simple, beautiful, and completely wrong. The body contained 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each corresponded to an element. Blood to air, phlegm to water, yellow bile to fire, black bile to earth. Each corresponded to a season. Blood to spring, yellow bile to summer, black bile to autumn, phlegm to winter. Each was associated with a pair of qualities: hot or cold, wet or dry. Blood was hot and wet. Phlegm was cold and wet. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. Health was balance. Illness was imbalance. A person with too much blood was flushed, energetic, feverish. too much phlegm made a person sluggish, pale, prone to colds. An excess of yellow bile produced irritability and digestive upset. An excess of black bile, the darkest humor, led to melancholy, that heavy, creeping sadness that the medieval world understood not as a mood disorder but as a literal surplus of cold, dry fluid pooling somewhere in the body. Within this framework, everything connected. Diet influenced the humors. So did weather, geography, emotional state, sleep patterns, sexual activity, and the position of the planets. A physician treating a fever wasn't just treating the fever. He was recalibrating an entire system of correspondences, adjusting the patient's relationship to the cosmos itself. And this is where the subversion lives. Because this was not ignorance. This was holistic, interconnected, rigorously taught, and peer-reviewed at every major university in Europe. A physician who graduated from Montpellier had studied for nearly a decade. He could debate the finer points of galenic physiology with the fluency of a modern specialist discussing immunology. He was, by every metric available to his culture, an expert. He was also almost entirely wrong about how the body worked. Bloodletting made perfect sense inside this framework. If a patient had a fever, they had an excess of blood, the hot and wet humor. The obvious treatment was to drain some, reduce the excess, restore the balance, and the fever would break. The logic was impeccable. The outcome was a weakened patient losing the very fluid their immune system needed most. Purging followed the same logic. An excess of bile meant the body needed to evacuate it, violently if necessary. So the physician prescribed emetics and laxatives powerful enough to leave the patient shaking and dehydrated, which was then interpreted as the body successfully expelling the offending humor. The system was self-confirming. If the patient improved, the treatment worked. If the patient worsened, the imbalance was deeper than initially assessed, and more aggressive treatment was needed. If the patient died, the imbalance had been too severe, or the stars had been unfavorable, or the patient had not confessed all their sins. There was, within this closed loop, almost no mechanism for the system to recognize its own failure. And that, more than any individual wrong treatment, is what made humoral medicine so dangerous. Not its ignorance, its certainty. The physician prescribed. The barber surgeon cut. This hierarchy was ironclad and deeply felt. The university-trained physician considered surgery to be manual labor beneath his intellectual station, roughly equivalent to asking a professor of philosophy to dig a ditch. So the actual physical work of medieval medicine fell to the barber surgeon, a tradesman who learned his craft through apprenticeship, operated out of a shop marked by a red and white striped pole, and was paid significantly less than the man who told him what to do. The barber surgeon's most common task was bloodletting. The tools were a lancet or a fleam, a small blade designed to nick a vein with precision. The vein was selected based on the diagnosis, which was itself based on the humoral assessment, which was itself based on the urine flask and the star chart. Different veins corresponded to different organs and different humoral pathways. A vein in the arm might be opened for a liver complaint. A vein behind the ear for a headache. The patient sat or lay down. A tourniquet was applied. The blade bit into the skin, and blood flowed into a shallow copper bowl. The smell of it was warm, metallic, alive. The prescribed quantity varied, sometimes a few ounces, sometimes a pint or more. The lightheadedness that followed was considered a positive sign, evidence that the excess humor was draining away. In reality, the patient was simply losing blood, and in cases of serious illness, this pushed them measurably closer to death. Bloodletting was performed with such frequency and enthusiasm that it became almost routine. Some physicians recommended it preventively, the way a modern doctor might recommend exercise. Monks were bled on a regular schedule. Healthy people submitted to the lancet as seasonal maintenance. The copper bowl, with its thin film of drying blood catching the candlelight, was as common a medical image as the stethoscope is today. Beyond bloodletting came purging. Medieval emetics and laxatives were not gentle. Antimony, hellebore, and various mercury compounds were administered to force the body to evacuate its humoral excess through every available exit. The patient would vomit and purge for hours, weakening to the point of collapse. The room would smell of bile and sweat and something sharply acidic. This was considered progress. Then there was cautery, the application of a red-hot iron directly to the skin. The theory held that intense heat could burn away corrupt humors, seal off pathways of disease, or stimulate the body's natural rebalancing. The smell of burning flesh, sweet and terrible, filled the room. The patient screamed or didn't, depending on their constitution and whether they had been given wine beforehand, which they usually had, because wine was the closest thing to anesthesia available. Cautery was sometimes performed preventively on perfectly healthy tissue as a kind of humoral firewall. For head ailments that resisted other treatments, there was trepanning, the drilling or scraping of a hole directly into the skull. This sounds exclusively fatal, but archaeological evidence tells a more surprising story. Skulls recovered from medieval burial sites show healed trepanation wounds, bone that regrew around the hole, meaning the patient survived the procedure and lived for years afterward. Not comfortably, perhaps, but alive. The medieval apothecary, meanwhile, offered pharmaceutical options. The most prestigious was theriac, a compound medicine containing dozens of ingredients, sometimes more than 60, including opium, cinnamon, myrrh, and in the most traditional recipes, the flesh of vipers. Theriac was considered a universal antidote, effective against poison, plague, melancholy, and digestive complaints alike. It was wildly expensive, and the opium content meant it did, in fairness, make people feel better. For a while. And then there were clysters, enemas, administered with a frequency and enthusiasm that bordered on devotional. Clysters were prescribed for fevers, headaches, constipation, melancholy, and conditions that had absolutely nothing to do with the lower intestine. The device was a metal syringe, sometimes disturbingly large, and the solution injected could contain anything from soapy water to herbal infusions to, on special occasions, tobacco smoke. Through all of this, one fact remained constant. There was no anesthesia beyond alcohol and opium. There was no antiseptic. There was no understanding of infection. The patient endured these procedures in full, conscious awareness of every sensation, trusting not because the treatments had proven effective, but because there was simply nothing else to trust. Illness in medieval Europe was an economic event as much as a physical one, and for most people, the financial damage outlasted the fever by years. For the poor, which was most people, Sickness meant one thing immediately: lost wages. There was no sick pay. There was no safety net. A laborer who could not work did not eat, and neither did his family. Within days, a household could slide from precarious stability into genuine crisis. The only institutional refuge was the monastic hospital, but calling it a hospital requires adjusting expectations dramatically. Institutions like the Hotel Dieu in Paris offered a bed, prayers, basic food, and the company of nuns who provided steady, compassionate care. What they did not offer, in most cases, was medical treatment. These were places to recover in, or to die in, with dignity and spiritual comfort. Multiple patients shared a single bed. The dying lay beside the recovering. The air smelled of tallow candles, linen that needed changing, and the particular heavy sweetness of bodies in various states of healing and not healing. For the middling class, the craftsmen and small merchants, illness was a different kind of catastrophe. They could, theoretically, afford a physician. But a single consultation might cost more than a month's wages. The apothecary's bill arrived on top of that. Theriac alone could cost a small fortune. A prolonged illness with multiple physician visits, prescriptions, and barber surgeon procedures could bankrupt a family that had taken generations to build its modest stability. Illness didn't just take health. It took the shop, the apprenticeship fees already paid, the dowry set aside for a daughter. The wealthy fared no better in outcomes, only in comfort. Noble households employed personal physicians, imported medicines from distant markets, and maintained elaborate sickroom rituals with fine linens and warmed wine. But the treatments were the same. The bloodletting was the same. The humoral logic was the same. The only difference was that the wealthy could afford to be made worse in more comfortable surroundings. And woven through all of this was the experience of women. Women served as the primary caregivers in almost every household, managing illness with practical skill passed from mother to daughter but never formalized, never credentialed, never compensated. When women themselves fell ill, they entered a medical system that treated their bodies as inherently unstable, their complaints as likely exaggerated, and their conditions as frequently rooted in moral weakness or emotional excess. The womb was considered a source of innumerable disorders, most of them vaguely defined and all of them attributed to the fundamental imbalance of the female constitution. Pregnancy was the most dangerous medical event a medieval woman faced, and she faced it repeatedly. Estimates suggest that roughly 1 in 10 births ended in the mother's death. A woman who survived 6 pregnancies had faced those odds 6 times. The midwife, not the physician, attended births, working with skill and experience, but without any of the tools, the sanitation, or the surgical backup that modern obstetrics takes for granted. Charity and almsgiving served as the only health insurance available. The church taught that caring for the sick was a spiritual duty, and this was not hollow rhetoric. Communities did rally. Neighbors did bring food. Monastic orders did build hospitals. But the system was patchwork, voluntary, and utterly insufficient for anything resembling a public health crisis. Which, as it happened, was exactly what was coming. In 1347, the plague arrived in Europe aboard Genoese trading ships docking at Messina, and within 3 years, it killed roughly 1/3 of the continent's population. The numbers are almost impossible to hold in the mind. 25 million people. Perhaps more. Entire villages emptied. cities lost half their inhabitants in months. And the medical system, the one with the urine flasks and the star charts and the 1,000-year pedigree, did nothing. This was not for lack of trying. Physicians consulted their texts. They examined urine. They bled patients. They prescribed theriac and aromatics and changes of diet. They did everything the system told them to do, and their patients died at exactly the same rate as people who received no treatment at all. The humoral framework, which had explained every previous illness with calm confidence, could not explain a disease that killed a healthy person in 3 days regardless of their humoral balance, their planetary alignment, or their moral character. Physicians fled cities. This is recorded not as rumor but as documented scandal. The men who had positioned themselves as guardians of health abandoned their posts when health became genuinely dangerous. Their departure was noted bitterly by chroniclers who watched the credentialed experts vanish while the neighbor women and the nuns stayed behind. Those who remained offered what they could. The famous plague doctors, in their long robes and beaked masks stuffed with dried flowers, cloves, and camphor, were operating on miasma theory, the belief that disease traveled through corrupted air. The beak was an air filter. It was wrong about the mechanism, but it was at least a theory that attempted to account for contagion, which the humoral system largely did not. The most prestigious medical body in Europe, the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Paris, issued an official report in 1348 explaining the plague's cause. Their conclusion: a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius had corrupted the atmosphere, generating pestilential vapors that unbalanced the humors of everyone they touched. The report was detailed, scholarly, and completely useless. The only advice that actually worked came not from physicians, but from common observation. Cedo, longe tard. Leave quickly. Go far away. Return slowly. This was not humoral medicine. This was people watching who died and who didn't, and noticing that distance helped. And from that same impulse, something genuinely new emerged. In 1377, the city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, required incoming ships to anchor offshore for 30 days before passengers could disembark. The period was eventually extended to 40 days, 40 giorni, giving us the word quarantine. This was not based on humoral theory. It was based on the radical, empirical observation that separating sick people from healthy people reduced the spread of disease. It was public health by survival instinct, and it worked. The plague cracked the system not because someone published a paper disproving Galen. It cracked because the pile of bodies grew too large for any theoretical framework to explain away. Surgeons, who had spent centuries as the physician's social inferiors, gained status through battlefield experience and practical wound care. Empirical observation, the simple act of watching what happened and adjusting accordingly, began to compete with textual authority for the first time in a millennium. The crack was slow. It would take centuries to widen into anything resembling modern medicine. But it started here, in the plague years, in the space between what the book said should happen and what actually did. The medieval physician is gone. The medulla is in a museum. The barber surgeon's pole survives only as a quaint decoration outside shops that no longer perform surgery. And yet, the hierarchy persists. The physician who diagnoses still stands above the practitioner who touches, the surgeon, the nurse, the technician. The gap has narrowed, but the architecture is the same. Someone thinks. Someone else does. The thinker is paid more. Illness still carries moral weight. Not in the language of sin and divine punishment, perhaps, but in the quieter language of personal responsibility. Obesity is framed as a failure of willpower. Addiction is framed as a failure of character. Mental illness is framed as something one should be able to manage with sufficient effort. The medieval priest asking what sins preceded the fever has been replaced by subtler questions, but the implication is the same. Somewhere in here, this is your fault. And the confidence of wrong expertise has not gone away. It has simply changed costumes. Medical history is littered with treatments prescribed with absolute certainty and then quietly abandoned. Bloodletting survived into the 19th century. Lobotomies won a Nobel Prize. Hormone replacement therapy was prescribed to millions of women before its risks were fully understood. Every era has its unshakable consensus, and every era is certain, truly certain, that this time the consensus is correct. The medieval physician was not a fool. He was a product of a system that told him he was right. He was surrounded by institutions that confirmed his training, by colleagues who shared his methods, by textbooks that had been authorities for 1,000 years. He looked at a flask of urine and saw meaning because he had been taught, rigorously and at great expense, to see meaning there. He bled his patients because every text he had ever read told him it would help. He consulted the stars because the curriculum required it and the theory demanded it. He believed. Sincerely. Completely. The way any professional believes in the system that trained them. The tragedy of medieval medicine is not that people were stupid. They were not. The tragedy is that they were trapped inside a system so internally consistent, so institutionally reinforced, so elegantly logical on its own terms, that there was almost no way to see out of it. The tools for self-correction did not yet exist. The concept that 1,000 years of authority could be fundamentally wrong was not just unlikely. It was nearly unthinkable. And so the treatments continued. The urine was examined. The blood was drained. The stars were consulted. And the patients, wrapped in damp wool blankets, burning with fever, trusting the only expertise available to them, endured. Somewhere in a low-ceilinged room, the fire has gone to embers again. The air smells of tallow and sweat and something faintly metallic. A copper bowl catches the last of the candlelight, and the thin film of blood inside it is already cooling. That iron taste. That is the taste of confidence. It lingers longer than you'd think. In the autumn of 1095, in a muddy field outside Clermont in central France, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd of bishops, nobles, and assorted opportunists, and delivered what might be the most successful fundraising pitch in human history. The crowd roared back with two words that still echo through every history textbook: Deus vult. God wills it. Stirring. Iconic. And almost entirely beside the point. Because enthusiasm, however divine, does not feed a warhorse. It does not shoe a mule. It does not purchase the 6 months of salted pork required to march 30,000 men from the fields of France to the walls of Jerusalem. A journey of roughly 2,500 miles through hostile terrain, contested borders, and weather that treated pilgrims and soldiers with equal indifference. God may have willed it, but someone had to pay for it. The popular image of the Crusades is all soaring cathedrals and gleaming swords, pious knights surging eastward on a tide of faith. The reality smelled considerably worse and involved a great deal more arithmetic. Somewhere in rural France, far from the Pope's thundering rhetoric, a parish priest stood in a peasant's barn, tallying sacks of grain against a ledger. No sword in sight. No cross on his chest. Just a man with ink-stained fingers and a mandate from Rome, doing the unglamorous work of converting belief into bushels and bushels into budget. Urban speech was not merely a spiritual call to arms. It was the church's first successful experiment in mass fundraising, a system that leveraged spiritual currency, remission of sins, indulgences, the promise of heaven to generate very material wealth. Believe hard enough, and the church would forgive your sins. Donate generously enough, and the church would fund an army. The two propositions were not unrelated. What followed over the next 2 centuries was not a clash of civilizations driven by pure faith. It was a financing problem disguised as a religious movement, sustained by parish tithes in rural France, Italian banking houses on the Mediterranean, and Jewish moneylenders who were simultaneously indispensable and despised. The Crusades did not happen because people believed hard enough. They happened because someone figured out how to make belief bankable. And the first miracle of the First Crusade? It had nothing to do with God. It had everything to do with fractured enemy politics and Italian shipping contracts. But we will get to that. Let's talk numbers. Uncomfortable, enormous, family-destroying numbers. A knight in the late 11th century did not simply grab a sword from above the mantle and ride east. Outfitting for crusade cost roughly 4 to 5 times a knight's annual income. To put that in terms a modern audience might appreciate, imagine liquidating your retirement savings, selling your house, borrowing against your children's future, and using all of it to buy a one-way ticket into a war zone where the survival rate was, to put it gently, discouraging. Start with the warhorse. A proper destrier, the heavy cavalry mount required for mounted combat, cost the equivalent of a small estate. And a smart crusader brought more than one, because war horses died with spectacular regularity. Disease, exhaustion, battle wounds, poor forage, the sheer misery of a 2,000-mile march through Anatolia in summer. Horses did not enjoy crusading. Nobody did, but horses were worse at hiding it. Then came the armor. A full suit of mail required months of specialized labor from a skilled armorer, and it was not optional. Weapons. A lance, a sword, a shield, a helmet. Replacement gear, because things broke constantly. Now add the retinue. A single knight required 3 to 5 support personnel, squires, servants, grooms for the horses, someone to maintain the equipment, all of whom needed feeding, housing, and compensating in some form, even if that compensation was mostly the promise that God would remember their suffering fondly. Scale this up. The First Crusade moved somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 people across a continent. Every single one of them needed food, water, shelter, and safe passage through territories whose rulers charged handsomely for the privilege of not being attacked. Robert of Normandy, eldest son of William the Conqueror, wanted to go on crusade. Lovely ambition. Small problem, he was broke. His solution was to mortgage the entire Duchy of Normandy to his brother, King William II of England, for 10,000 marks of silver. An entire duchy pledged as collateral for a holy war. William, who was not notably pious, accepted the deal with what historians can only assume was a very satisfied expression. Robert was not unusual. Across France, Germany, and the Low Countries, noble families were making identical calculations and arriving at identical conclusions. Crusading required the liquidation of generational wealth. Estates were mortgaged. Lands were sold at a loss. Families were left behind to manage debts they had no realistic hope of repaying, particularly if the crusader in question did them the discourtesy of dying somewhere near Antioch, which a significant number did. The wives and children left behind inherited not glory but ledgers full of red ink. Estates shrank. Holdings were carved up. The financial devastation of the First Crusade rippled through the minor nobility of Western Europe for decades. The Church could inspire departure. What it could not do, not yet, was sustain an army in the field. That problem would haunt every subsequent crusade, growing larger and more expensive each time until someone, inevitably, invented a solution. That solution was taxation, and it was even less popular than dying in Anatolia. In 1187, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, and Christian Europe responded with the one thing more powerful than prayer: a tax bill. Before the Crusades, the Church had no mechanism to tax laypeople directly for military purposes. Kings taxed. Lords taxed. The Church collected voluntary donations, demanded feudal obligations, and accepted gifts from the guilty and the dying with gracious hands. But a mandatory, universal tax levied on all Christians for the purpose of funding a specific war? That had never been done. The Saladin tithe changed everything. Imposed in 1188 by Henry II of England and Philip II of France, the tithe demanded 10% of all income and movable property from every person who was not personally taking the cross. If you were going on crusade, you were exempt. If you were staying home, comfortable in your barn with your grain and your livestock, then the Church and the crown would like their cut. Thank you very much. God's war was not free, and neither, it turned out, was staying out of it. The collection happened at the parish level, and this is where the thing becomes visceral. Imagine the scene. A priest arrives at a peasant's door in rural France. Not with a blessing, not with communion wine, but with a ledger. He walks through the barn. He counts sacks of grain. He estimates the value of livestock. He notes the plow, the cart, the linen stored in the chest. He writes it all down, calculates 10%, and informs the family of what they owe. The spiritual authority who baptized their children is now auditing their pantry. The intimacy of it was the cruelty. This was not a distant king demanding silver from a lord. This was a neighbor's priest inventorying a neighbor's property, and if the numbers seemed low, there were local juries, committees of fellow parishioners, empowered to assess whether someone was hiding goods. Peer surveillance dressed in holy vestments. Communities turned on themselves. People buried coins in fields. Farmers underreported harvests. The tithe was deeply, furiously unpopular, even among the genuinely pious, because being told to love God was one thing, and being told to fund a war with 10% of everything you owned was something else entirely. The enforcement mechanism had teeth. Excommunication for non-payment. Social ostracism for resistance. The spiritual threat was real. To be cut off from the sacraments was, in the medieval worldview, to be cut off from salvation itself. Pay the tax or lose your soul. A remarkably efficient collection strategy. But here is the detail that matters most, the one that outlasted the crusade itself. Henry and Philip did not invent the Saladin tithe purely out of religious devotion. They used holy war as justification for expanding royal taxing power, for reaching directly into the pockets of their subjects in a way that feudal custom had never previously allowed. The precedent survived long after the crusade ended. Kings discovered that once people accepted being taxed for God's war, they could be taxed for the king's war too. And then for the king's peace. And then for the king's roads. The Crusades did not just fund armies. They funded the modern state. The fastest route from Europe to the Holy Land was by sea. And every viable sea route ran through waters controlled by 3 Italian city-states whose devotion to God was exceeded only by their devotion to profit margins. Venice, Genoa, Pisa. The holy trinity of Mediterranean commerce, each one possessing exactly what the Crusaders needed: ships, sailors, navigational expertise, and a willingness to negotiate that bordered on the predatory. No crusade could reach the Levant by sea without passing through Italian hands, and Italian hands were never, under any circumstances, open for free. The relationship was symbiotic in the way that a lamprey's relationship with a shark is symbiotic. Crusaders needed transport. Italian merchants needed access to Levantine ports, where the real money was: spices, silk, sugar, dyes, and all the fragrant luxuries that Europe craved and could not produce. Every crusading army that boarded a Venetian galley was, whether its soldiers knew it or not, a floating investment in commercial real estate. The deal worked like this. Italian cities provided ships and supplies. In exchange, they received trade concessions in whatever territories the Crusaders conquered. Entire quarters of cities like Acre, Tyre, and Antioch were handed over to Italian merchants, who operated them not as outposts of Christendom but as permanent colonial trading posts. These neighborhoods had their own laws, their own courts, their own warehouses stacked with goods that moved freely between Christian and Muslim ports. Because here is the part the recruitment posters never mentioned. Italian merchants traded with Muslim cities throughout the entire crusading period. Commerce never paused, not even during active military campaigns. A Venetian ship might carry soldiers to besiege a Muslim port on Monday and deliver trade goods to a different Muslim port on Wednesday. Business was business. God could sort out the contradictions. The masterpiece of this arrangement was the Fourth Crusade, which deserves a special place in the history of contractual disasters. In 1201, the leaders of the Fourth Crusade contracted with Venice to transport 33,500 soldiers to Egypt for the staggering sum of 85,000 silver marks. It was the largest naval contract in medieval history. It was also a catastrophic miscalculation, because the Crusaders could not actually recruit 33,500 soldiers. which meant they could not actually pay 85,000 marks. Enter Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice. He was over 80. He was blind. He was also, by any reasonable measure, one of the most ruthlessly effective negotiators of the medieval period. Dandolo looked at an army that owed him an unpayable debt and saw an opportunity. He offered to defer payment if the Crusaders would first help Venice recapture the city of Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast. They agreed. Then he suggested they might also pay a visit to Constantinople, the richest Christian city on earth, to settle a convenient dynastic dispute. They agreed to that too. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople. Not Jerusalem. Not Cairo. Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christianity, looted and burned by Western Christians who had set out to fight Muslims. The city's treasures were stripped. Its churches were desecrated. Its population was brutalized. And Venice walked away with 3/8 of the Byzantine Empire, including Crete and a chain of strategic ports that would anchor Venetian commercial dominance for centuries. God wanted Jerusalem. Venice wanted a shipping lane. Venice got what it wanted. Christian doctrine in the medieval period was unambiguous on one point. Lending money at interest was a sin. Usury, the church called it, and usurers could expect hellfire with the confidence of a sunrise. Which created a marvelous problem because crusades required enormous amounts of borrowed capital, and someone had to lend it. This someone, more often than not, was Jewish. Jewish communities across England, France, and the Rhineland occupied a unique and deeply precarious economic niche. Barred from owning land, excluded from most guilds, they were simultaneously pushed into moneylending by Christian restrictions and despised for practicing it. They became indispensable financiers to the very nobility that publicly scorned them. A lord who needed 10,000 marks for crusade could not borrow from a Christian lender without endangering both their souls. He could, however, borrow from a Jewish one. The sin was the Jews' problem. The money was the Lord's. The cruelty of this arrangement revealed itself almost immediately. In 1096, as the armies of the First Crusade gathered and marched eastward, mobs of crusaders attacked Jewish communities in the Rhineland, massacring thousands in Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. The violence was fueled by religious fervor, certainly, but it carried a grotesque financial logic. Kill the creditors, and the debts die with them. Borrow from the Jews, slaughter the Jews, march onward to the Holy Land with clean ledgers and bloody hands. The pattern repeated across subsequent crusades with nauseating predictability. The Church occasionally condemned the massacres. It never stopped them. And it never stopped needing the money. Into this void stepped the Knights Templar, who solved the usury problem by simply being Christians who handled money so cleverly that nobody could quite call it lending. Founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, the Templars evolved into something far more powerful, the medieval world's first international bank. A knight could deposit funds at the Templar house in Paris and withdraw an equivalent sum in Acre, carried not as heavy coin across bandit-infested roads, but as a letter of credit, a slip of parchment worth a fortune. The Templars managed deposits, facilitated transfers, and financed kings, all while maintaining the polite fiction that none of it was technically usury. They became so wealthy that Philip IV of France, who owed them a great deal of money and possessed a flexible relationship with both honesty and gratitude, had the order dissolved in 1307. The charges were heresy, sorcery, and assorted creative blasphemies. The real charge was that the Templars had more money than the king, and the king wanted it. Members were arrested, tortured into confessions, and burned. Their assets were seized. The largest financial institution in medieval Europe was dismantled not by market failure but by royal greed wearing a heresy costume. The pattern is worth noting because it repeats. Societies celebrate the warriors. They build statues to generals and name streets after kings. The financiers who made the wars possible are tolerated during the fighting and discarded the moment they become inconvenient. The Jewish moneylenders of the Rhineland. The Templars of Paris. Essential, despised, and ultimately expendable. The First Crusade is often presented as a miracle. A ragged army of Western European knights, many of whom had never left their home provinces, marched across a continent, fought through Anatolia, besieged Antioch for 8 brutal months, and captured Jerusalem in 1099. Against all odds. By the grace of God. Except it was not against all odds. It was against a fractured, feuding, internally collapsing political landscape that could not have been better designed for invasion if the Crusaders had drawn it up themselves. The Seljuk Turks, who controlled much of Anatolia and the northern Levant, were Sunni Muslims. The Fatimid Caliphate, which controlled Egypt and parts of southern Palestine, including Jerusalem, was Shia. These two powers hated each other with a consistency and intensity that made the Crusaders look like a minor inconvenience. When Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah died in 1092, 3 years before Urban's speech at Clermont, the Seljuk Empire splintered into warring successor states. Anatolia became a patchwork of rival emirs more interested in fighting each other than repelling a foreign invasion they initially did not take seriously. The Fatimids, meanwhile, actually welcomed the Crusaders at first, hoping these strange Western barbarians might weaken the Seljuk Turks. By the time the Fatimids realized the Crusaders intended to take Jerusalem for themselves, it was too late. The city fell in July of 1099, and the resulting massacre was so thorough that chroniclers on both sides described streets running with blood. This was not military genius. This was opportunism on a continental scale, an army stumbling into the largest power vacuum in the medieval Middle East and claiming divine credit for the result. Then the vacuum closed. Saladin spent decades doing what no leader before him had managed, unifying Egypt, Syria, and the Jazira under a single command. It was not primarily a military project. It was a political and financial one, consolidating tax revenues, centralizing supply chains, building the logistical infrastructure that could sustain a prolonged campaign. When Saladin finally turned his attention to the Crusader states, he did so with unified command, reliable supply lines, and patience. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 was the thesis made flesh. The Crusader army, fractured by internal feuds, crippled by debt, and lured into waterless terrain, was annihilated. Saladin did not win at Hattin because he was divinely favored. He won because he had spent 20 years building the one thing the Crusaders never had: financial and political coherence. The same tactics that had worked for the First Crusade, heavy cavalry charges, fortified positions, feudal levies, became catastrophically inadequate against a unified opponent with superior logistics. The miracle of 1099 had been a fluke of timing. When the timing changed, so did everything else. God did not choose sides. Ledgers did. Conquering territory is expensive. Holding it is ruinous. The Crusader states, collectively known as Outremer, stretched along the Levantine coast in a thin, vulnerable ribbon of Christian territory surrounded on nearly every side by powers that would have preferred them gone. Maintaining this ribbon required castles, garrisons, settlers, supply lines, and a permanent military presence that the crusading model was spectacularly ill-equipped to sustain. The castles alone were financial sinkholes. Crac des Chevaliers, the great hospitaller fortress in modern Syria, was a masterwork of military architecture. It was also fantastically expensive to maintain. Walls needed mortar. Garrisons needed pay. Storerooms needed filling. The military orders, Templars and Hospitallers, shouldered much of this burden, but even their considerable resources strained under the weight of permanent frontier defense. The stone was beautiful. The invoices were not. The deeper problem was demographic. Most crusaders, having fulfilled their holy vow by fighting a battle or completing a pilgrimage, went home. They were visitors, not settlers. The Crusader states were chronically underpopulated, ruled by a thin European elite over a majority Muslim and Eastern Christian population whose enthusiasm for Frankish governance was, at best, muted. Attracting permanent settlers proved nearly impossible. Why would a French farmer abandon his fields to farm identical crops in a hotter climate, surrounded by hostile neighbors, under a political system that might collapse at any moment? The sales pitch, it turned out, had limits. This meant Outremer was dependent on constant infusions of European cash, soldiers, and supplies, a dependency that became harder to satisfy as crusading enthusiasm waned with each subsequent generation. The Second Crusade, launched in 1147, was a humiliating failure. The Third Crusade recovered some territory, but not Jerusalem. Each iteration was more expensive, attracted fewer volunteers, and achieved less. Louis IX of France provides the definitive case study in financial overreach. His Seventh Crusade, launched in 1248, cost an estimated 1.5 million livres tournois, roughly 6 times the annual revenue of the French crown. Louis mortgaged the future of his kingdom for a campaign that ended in catastrophic defeat in Egypt, his own capture, and a ransom of 400,000 livres that nearly broke the treasury. He went on crusade again in 1270 and died of disease in Tunis before reaching the Holy Land, because the universe, occasionally, has a sense of narrative structure. The financial hemorrhaging was slow but irreversible. Garrisons shrank because there was no money for pay. Walls crumbled because there was no money for mortar. Alliances fractured because there was no money for diplomacy. The Italian merchant quarters in Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold, fought each other as often as they fought the Muslims, because when the resources dry up, the partnerships dissolve. Acre fell in 1291. The Mamluk siege was brutal, but the city's fate had been sealed years earlier in 1,000 small surrenders. The unfilled garrison post, the unrepaired wall, the unanswered letter requesting reinforcements that never came. The Crusader states did not die in a blaze of holy martyrdom. They died the way most empires die, one unpaid invoice at a time. 2 centuries of holy war. Hundreds of thousands dead. Kingdoms built and lost. And what survived? Not the Holy Sepulchre, which the Crusaders held for 88 years before losing it for good. Not the conversion of Muslims, which never happened on any meaningful scale. not the unity of Christendom, which the Fourth Crusade shattered more effectively than any Muslim army ever could. What survived was the paperwork. The Crusades' most durable legacy is not religious or territorial. It is financial. The innovations born of desperate necessity during 2 centuries of poorly funded holy war became the foundation of modern state finance. The Saladin tithe was a prototype for income taxation, the radical notion that a government could reach directly into every household and extract a percentage of its wealth for a declared public purpose. Kings discovered they liked this power. They kept it. The Templars' letters of credit and deposit systems were prototypes for international banking, the ability to move wealth across borders without moving gold. Italian merchants' trade concessions in Crusader ports were prototypes for colonial commerce, the embedding of commercial infrastructure in militarily conquered territory. Every one of these innovations outlasted the crusade that created it, by centuries. Return for a moment to that parish priest in rural France. The one standing in the barn, counting sacks of grain, noting the livestock, writing figures in a ledger while a family watches in tight-lipped silence. He believed, perhaps sincerely, that he was serving God's war. He was serving God's war. But he was also, without knowing it, beta testing the modern tax state. The mechanism he enforced, direct assessment of individual wealth by a central authority, collected through local agents, backed by social pressure and institutional threat, is the mechanism by which every modern government funds itself. The language changed. The robes changed. The ledger did not. And beneath every ledger entry, then and now, is a human cost that the numbers obscure. Families bankrupted by tithes they could not afford. Communities destroyed by massacres their creditors could not survive. Lives spent as line items in someone else's holy budget. The columns balanced. The people did not. The Crusades taught Europe something it never forgot. That ideology is the recruitment poster, but accounting is the engine. That faith fills the ranks, but finance decides the outcome. That the most powerful force in any war is not the army with the strongest belief, but the army with the most reliable supply chain, the deepest treasury, the most sustainable tax base. Every war since has been fought the same way. The flags change. The prayers change. The spreadsheets fundamentally do not. The faith faded. The kingdoms crumbled. The receipts survived. The marble is warm. That is the first thing anyone would have noticed stepping through the colonnades of the Mouseion on a morning in the early 3rd century before the Common Era. Warm stone under sandaled feet, heated by a Mediterranean sun that did not so much rise over Alexandria as settle onto it like a bright, insistent hand. The air carried salt from the harbor, papyrus dust from the stacks, and the faint sweetness of the botanical gardens where imported plants from 3 continents were quietly not dying under the supervision of scholars who believed that understanding nature required, at minimum, a well-funded greenhouse. The Mouseion of Alexandria. Not a museum. Not in the way modern ears hear the word. The term meant temple of the muses, and it was exactly that, a sacred precinct dedicated to the 9 divine patrons of art, science, and every discipline humans had yet bothered to name. But where a typical temple offered incense and prayer, This one offered something far more dangerous: a salary. The complex sprawled across the royal Bruchian quarter, nestled against the palace grounds like an intellectual appendage the Ptolemaic dynasty had grown on purpose. Covered walkways, or peripatos, connected open-air lecture porticos to communal dining halls. A roofed ambulatory offered shade for the kind of walking arguments Greek philosophers considered essential to the thinking process. Beyond the main hall lay botanical gardens stocked with specimens from Egypt, Persia, and the upper reaches of the Nile. Astronomical observation platforms jutted upward, angled to track the motion of stars across Alexandria's famously clear night sky. And beside all of it, connected both physically and administratively, sat the Great Library, the most famous collection of scrolls the ancient world would ever assemble. Everyone remembers the library. Everyone mourns it, usually in breathless tones reserved for civilizational tragedy. And, fair enough, the loss was staggering. But almost nobody remembers the living institution that gave the library its purpose, the research commune where the people who actually read those scrolls lived, ate, argued, and occasionally made discoveries that would reshape the trajectory of human knowledge for millennia. Around 280 years before the Common Era, the Mouseion was at its peak. Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, which translates roughly to sibling lover, a nickname that tells its own complicated story, had expanded what his father began. The campus hummed. Scholars from Athens, Syracuse, Cyrene, and the coasts of Anatolia roamed the covered walks, their conversations overlapping in the particular acoustic chaos of competitive Greek intellectualism. The sound of scholarly argument drifted from open porticos and across courtyard gardens, a constant low roar of people who were professionally certain they were right. It was, by any measure, the most advanced intellectual community on Earth. It was also, in ways that would take a few chapters to fully appreciate, a cage. A beautiful one. Gilded, comfortable, stocked with the finest food and wine and the most extraordinary collection of written knowledge ever gathered in a single place. But a cage nonetheless. Because the scholars of the Mouseion were there at the pleasure of the king. Their meals came from the royal kitchen. Their stipends came from the royal treasury. Their scrolls came from royal acquisitions that were, as we will see, not always conducted through what one might charitably call voluntary exchange. The crown welcomed them in with open arms. It simply preferred they never leave. The Ptolemies were not philanthropists. This is worth stating clearly, because the scale of their generosity can make them look like ancient Medicists with better tans. They were not funding the life of the mind because they found the life of the mind intrinsically beautiful. They were funding it because in the Hellenistic world, knowledge was a weapon. Ptolemy I, called Soter, the savior, was a Macedonian general who had inherited Egypt in the bloody aftermath of Alexander the Great's death. He had a kingdom. He had grain, gold, and a strategic position on the Mediterranean. What he did not have was cultural legitimacy. Athens had Plato's Academy. It had Aristotle's Lyceum. It had centuries of intellectual tradition baked into its civic identity. Alexandria, by contrast, was barely a generation old. A planned city, founded on a strip of coast between a lake and the sea, populated largely by transplanted Greeks ruling a vast Egyptian population that did not especially ask for any of this. So the Ptolemies did what ambitious rulers have always done when they cannot inherit prestige. They bought it. The recruitment packages were extraordinary. Free housing in the royal quarter. Free meals daily in the communal dining hall. Complete tax exemption, which in Ptolemaic Egypt, where taxes touched nearly every transaction of daily life, was a gift of almost absurd generosity. And access. Access to the library, which the Ptolemies were filling at a pace that bordered on compulsive, acquiring scrolls from every port, every market, every visiting ship. Scholars came. Of course they came. The offer was irresistible. Where else could a mathematician or a poet or an anatomist live without financial worry, surrounded by the greatest collection of written thought ever assembled, arguing with peers who were genuinely the finest minds of the age? The only thing the Ptolemies asked in return was everything. Not explicitly, not in writing. But the understanding was clear enough. The work produced under the Mousseion's roof reflected on the dynasty. The discoveries, the poems, the catalogues, the star charts, all of it burnished the Ptolemaic name. Alexandria's intellectual output was, in the language of a much later era, soft power. Every breakthrough told the world that the Ptolemies ruled not just the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean, but the smartest one. Modern research universities pretend the relationship between funding and output is incidental. The Ptolemies, to their credit, never bothered with the pretense. The communal dining hall, the syndeipnon, smelled like warm bread, olive oil, and ambition. It was the beating heart of the Mouseion, the space where scholars gathered not merely to eat, but to perform the ancient art of being publicly brilliant at someone else's expense. The tables were long. The wine was decent, funded by a crown that understood the relationship between alcohol and loosened intellectual inhibition. The bread was fresh, Egyptian wheat, being one of the few resources Ptolemaic Alexandria never lacked. Figs, dates, cheese, fish from the harbor, sometimes roasted meats. The meals were not lavish by royal standards, but by the standards of a scholar who might otherwise be scraping by on tutoring fees in Athens. They were paradise on a plate. And the noise. The glorious, insufferable noise. Picture a room full of the most intelligent people alive, all of whom know they are the most intelligent people alive, all of whom have been given free food and no deadlines. The arguments did not pause for chewing. They did not pause for breathing. A geometer might be mid-proof when a poet across the table interrupted with an objection that was technically about meter but was really about ego. A physician might describe a dissection in terms vivid enough to make the man beside him lose interest in his fish. The dining hall was a crucible, and what it forged was not always gold, but it was never boring. The names that passed through the syndeipnon would individually be enough to anchor entire chapters in the history of human thought. Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth using shadow angles and a well unseen, and arrived at a figure so close to accurate that it remained unsurpassed for over 1,000 years. Euclid, whose systematization of geometry and the elements would serve as the foundational mathematics textbook for roughly 23 centuries, a publishing run that makes modern bestseller lists look like pamphlets. Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed that the earth revolved around the sun some 1,700 years before Copernicus was born, and was roundly ignored for the trouble. Herophilus and Erasistratus, whose anatomical work we will arrive at shortly, and whose methods will require the narrator to take a steadying breath. And then there was Callimachus. Callimachus of Cyrene was a poet, a critic, and in his capacity as the library's great cataloger, essentially the inventor of library science. His Pinakes, a 120-volume catalog of the library's holdings organized by genre and author, was a monument of intellectual labor so staggering it makes modern database architects look like hobbyists. He was also, by all surviving accounts, spectacularly petty. His feud with Apollonius of Rhodes was the kind of literary rivalry that academics dream about and therapists dread. Apollonius had written the Argonautica, a long-form epic in the Homeric tradition. Callimachus believed long-form epic was finished, that the future of poetry lay in short, dense, elusive work that rewarded careful reading. His famous dictum, "A big book is a big evil," was not abstract literary theory. It was a personal attack. The feud escalated. Poems were written about poems. Counter-poems were written about the poems about poems. Students took sides. Apollonius may have left Alexandria entirely for a time, retreating to Rhodes, possibly in disgust, possibly in defeat. Callimachus, for his part, never stopped being pointed about it. Anyone who has spent time in a modern university department will recognize this dynamic instantly. The content may have been elevated, but the energy was pure faculty lounge. Brilliant people in close quarters, competing for prestige, resources, and the attention of a patron who could elevate or destroy a career with a gesture. The meals were free, but nothing in the Mouseion came without cost. The wine kept flowing. The arguments kept sharpening. And somewhere down the hall, past the gardens and the lecture porticos, there was a room where the arguments took a very different form. This is the chapter the story has been circling. It is time to walk toward it. The Mouseion's contributions to anatomical science were, by the standards of the ancient world, almost miraculously advanced. Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Chios were the two physicians most responsible, and their achievements read like a catalog of foundational medical breakthroughs. Herophilus distinguished arteries from veins, a distinction that seems obvious now, but which had eluded centuries of physicians who had only ever examined the dead, by which point the arteries had emptied and looked, unhelpfully, identical to other tubes. He mapped the nervous system. He identified the brain, not the heart, as the seat of intelligence, overturning a belief that had persisted since the Egyptians and that Aristotle himself had endorsed. Erasistratus came tantalizingly close to understanding the circulatory system, describing the relationship between veins, arteries, and the heart with a precision that would not be matched until William Harvey in the 17th century. These were not minor refinements. These were paradigm-shattering insights that redirected the course of medicine for millennia. The question that follows is the one that matters. How did they know? The Roman medical writer Celsus, writing roughly 300 years later, recorded the answer plainly. Herophilus and Erasistratus did not limit their investigations to the dead. They performed vivisection on living human beings, specifically on condemned prisoners provided to them by the Ptolemaic crown. Let that settle for a moment. The practice, if Celsus is to be believed, and most historians consider his account credible, involved opening the bodies of living, conscious prisoners to observe the function of organs in real time. The motion of the heart, the behavior of the lungs, the response of nerves when exposed and manipulated. The prisoners were, by all accounts, criminals sentenced to death, and the Ptolemaic state apparently reasoned that their bodies could serve a greater purpose than simple execution. The scholars apparently reasoned the same. The narrator is going to resist the urge to describe the room in detail. What can be said is this: it smelled of iron and cedar oil. The light came from lamps, not windows. The sounds were not the sounds of the dining hall. Herophilus reportedly justified the practice by arguing that the pain of a few condemned individuals was outweighed by the knowledge gained, knowledge that would, in his view, save countless future lives. And here is the part that makes the stomach turn not with revulsion alone, but with something more complicated. He was right. The knowledge did save future lives. The anatomical understanding that emerged from the Mouseion became the foundation of Galenic medicine, which dominated medical practice for over 1,000 years. The distinction between sensory and motor nerves, which Herophilus first described, remains fundamental to neuroscience today. The discoveries were real. The suffering was real. And the distance between those two realities is exactly zero. There is a modern instinct to resolve this discomfort, to come down firmly on one side. Either the knowledge justifies the means, or it does not. But the Mouseion does not permit that clean resolution. The prisoners who were cut open had no names that survived. They left no accounts. Their pain served a dynasty's prestige and a physician's curiosity. And the medicine that resulted went on to help millions of people who never knew and never asked. The Ptolemaic state did not see a contradiction. It saw efficiency. Condemned prisoners were a resource, and the crown allocated resources where they might yield the greatest return. The anatomy theater was, in the cold calculus of empire, simply another line in the budget. This is not a comfortable place to rest. But comfort was never equally distributed in Alexandria. And the scholars who returned to the dining hall after a session in the anatomy theater still ate well, still argued brilliantly, and still slept in rooms paid for by a king who had just handed them a living body and a knife. Some knowledge arrives clean. Some does not. The Mouseion never pretended otherwise. It simply did not ask the prisoners for their opinion on the matter. Step back from the anatomy theater. Breathe the salt air again. Look out across the harbor where ships are arriving daily, their hulls heavy with cargo, and consider what happened next to every single one of those ships. Ptolemy III, called Euergetes, the benefactor, another name that earns its own quiet irony, implemented a policy that distilled the Ptolemaic relationship with knowledge into a single, elegant act of institutional theft. Every ship entering Alexandria's harbor was searched. Every book found on board was confiscated. The scrolls were taken to the library where scribes produced copies. The copies were returned to the ships. The originals stayed. The Ptolemies called the originals the scrolls from the ships. They filed them in the library with the pride of a collector who has never once confused acquisition with consent. This was the ecosystem the Mouseion scholars inhabited. The knowledge they relied on had been, in many cases, taken by force or by administrative fiat. The scrolls they studied were spoils. The meals they ate were royal gifts that could, in theory, be revoked. Their stipends came not from an independent endowment, but from the personal treasury of a monarch whose interest in intellectual freedom extended precisely as far as intellectual freedom remained useful. Some scholars flourished in this arrangement, finding the freedom from financial worry genuinely liberating. Others understood the unspoken terms and stayed carefully within them. A few, over the centuries, pushed too hard and discovered what happened when a patron's generosity met a patron's displeasure. The modern parallel practically draws itself. Corporate-funded research labs produce extraordinary science, and the corporations retain the patents. Government grants fund breakthrough discoveries, and the granting bodies shape which questions get asked. Pharmaceutical companies fund clinical trials, and the results, curiously, tend to favor the funder's product at rates that statistics alone cannot explain. The question of who owns knowledge when someone else pays for its production is not ancient. It is ongoing, and it has never been resolved. The Ptolemies simply had the decency not to dress it up. The transaction was visible. The cage was gilded, and everyone inside it could see the bars. The Mouseion was not only a house of science, it was equally, and sometimes more loudly, a house of words. Poets, literary critics, grammarians, and philologists occupied the same colonnades as the mathematicians and physicians. And if the scientists were reshaping the understanding of the natural world, the literary scholars were doing something arguably just as consequential. They were deciding which words would survive. The Alexandrian literary style that emerged from the Mouseion was distinctive, instantly recognizable, and to its critics, insufferably clever. Where Homer had been expansive, direct, and muscular, the Alexandrian poets were compressed, elusive, and technically dazzling. A single short poem might contain references to 3 mythological traditions, 2 regional dialects, and 1 very pointed jab at a colleague down the hall. Reading Alexandrian poetry without footnotes is a bit like arriving at an inside joke several centuries too late, which, to the Alexandrians, was rather the point. Callimachus, whose feuding habits have already made an appearance, was the architect of this aesthetic. His insistence that poetry should be refined, learned, and short was not merely a stylistic preference. It was a manifesto. And his Pinakies, the monumental catalog of the library's holdings, was the practical extension of the same philosophy. Every scroll organized. Every author categorized by genre, birthplace, and major works. It was, in essence, the invention of library science, the first systematic attempt to impose order on the chaotic abundance of human written output. But the literary scholars of the Mouseion did something even more lasting than invent cataloging. They preserved Homer. The texts of the Iliad and the Odyssey that exist today are not pristine transmissions from the 8th century before the Common Era. They are the products of Alexandrian editorial labor. Scholars like Xenodotus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and Aristarchus of Samothrace spent decades comparing manuscript variants, noting corruptions, arguing over word choices, and establishing what they considered the most authoritative versions of the texts. Without their work, the Homeric epics might have fragmented into regional variants and eventually dissolved, the way countless other oral traditions did. The irony is rich enough to taste. A captive intellectual class, housed and fed by autocrats, funded by a dynasty that confiscated books from ships, created the editorial tools and practices that ensured the survival of the Greek literary tradition. The tradition of free inquiry, of open debate, of intellectual courage, survived in large part because unfree scholars in a gilded cage decided it was worth preserving. They were right. the tools they built are still in use. Every critical edition, every scholarly footnote, every library classification system traces its lineage back to a room full of anxious, brilliant people eating the king's bread and trying to save the world's words. Ptolemaic Alexandria was, outside the Mouseion's walls, a rigidly stratified society. Greeks ruled. Egyptians labored. A vast bureaucracy extracted wealth from the Nile Valley and funneled it toward a coastal capital that the majority of Egypt's population would never see. Social mobility was not a concept the Ptolemies encouraged, except in one very specific, very curated space. The Mouseion was, in theory, a meritocracy. A scholar from a modest background in Cyrene could dine beside a member of the royal court if his work was brilliant enough. Foreign intellectuals from rival kingdoms, Seleucid Antioch, Attalid Pergamon, the city-states of Sicily, were welcomed without prejudice because their presence enhanced the prestige of the institution that housed them. For a brief, shining window, the dining hall looked almost egalitarian. Almost. Because human beings, given any social space at all, will construct a hierarchy inside it faster than you can say pecking order. Within a generation, the Mouseion had developed its own internal stratifications. Seniority mattered. Royal favor mattered more. Access to the best scrolls, the prime reading rooms, the ear of the king, these became currencies as potent as any drachma. A junior scholar might technically share a dining table with Eratosthenes, but the distance between their positions was measured in something far more precise than seating. The Mouseion disrupted one set of social rules and built another in its place. It was a commune that behaved like a court. A temple to the muses that operated, in practice, like any other institution where talented people compete for limited resources under the gaze of a powerful patron. This, too, feels instantly modern. The university department that prides itself on openness while running on unspoken hierarchies of publication count and grant money. The research lab where everyone is equal except the person whose name goes first on the paper. The Mouseion invented that dynamic. Or perhaps it simply revealed that the dynamic was always there, waiting for a room and a budget. The Mouseion did not die in a fire. This is worth saying because the popular imagination has constructed a single dramatic moment of destruction. A great burning of the library, usually attributed to Julius Caesar or sometimes to later Christian or Muslim conquerors, depending on which version of the story the teller finds most satisfying. The reality, as reality tends to be, was slower, quieter, and sadder. Caesar's civil war in 48 before the Common Era did cause fire damage to parts of the harbor district, and some warehouse stores of scrolls were likely lost. But the library and the Mouseion were not in the harbor. They were in the Bruchian quarter. The institution survived Caesar. It survived Cleopatra. It even survived, in diminished form, the Roman absorption of Egypt into the imperial system after 30 before the Common Era. What it did not survive was the slow withdrawal of relevance. Under Roman rule, the terms of patronage shifted. The Ptolemaic kings had funded the Mouseion as a centerpiece of dynastic prestige. Roman emperors had other centerpieces, other cities, other priorities. Funding continued, but unevenly. The scholars grew more conservative, more focused on commentary and preservation than on original discovery. The dining hall still served meals. The arguments still filled the colonnades. But the energy was different. Less a hothouse, more a greenhouse running on residual warmth. By the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, the Bruchian quarter had suffered physical damage from Roman military campaigns against Alexandrian revolts. The intellectual community had fragmented. Some scholars migrated to other centers of learning. Others simply aged out, and the replacements were fewer, less ambitious, less generously funded. The great age of discovery gave way to an age of preservation, which gave way to something that was not quite decline and not quite death, but felt, from a distance, like a long exhalation. The salt air still came off the harbor. The marble colonnades still stood, though some were cracked now, patched with materials that did not quite match. The botanical gardens had thinned. The arguments, where they continued, were quieter. What the Ptolemies had built was, in the end, an institution with a single fatal dependency, the continued interest of whoever held the purse. When that interest waned, the institution waned with it. No endowment protected it. No charter guaranteed its survival. It existed because power found it useful, and it faded when power looked elsewhere. This is the inheritance the Mouseion left. Not just the circumference of the earth, or the geometry that still underpins engineering, or the anatomical knowledge bought at a price that should never be forgotten. The Mouseion also bequeathed the model. The state-funded research institution where brilliant minds gather under one roof, eat meals they did not pay for, and produce knowledge that someone else will own. The modern university. The corporate research lab. The government think tank. All of them are, in some sense, descendants of that complex beside the harbor, where the air smelled of papyrus and salt and the quiet, persistent tension of people who were free to think anything, so long as they remembered who was paying for the privilege. The Ptolemies built the dining hall. We are still eating in it. We have simply gotten better at pretending we chose the menu. In the year 1083, in the heart of the most sophisticated city on earth, a baby was born in a room specifically designed to make that birth matter. The porphyra chamber of the great palace in Constantinople was lined with purple stone, imperial purple, the color that separated emperors from everyone who wished they were one. To be born in that room was to be porphyrogenita, born in the purple, a phrase that still rattles around the English language because of rooms exactly like this one. The air inside would have smelled of incense and beeswax and the particular tension that follows a dynasty still finding its footing. The baby was Anna. Her father was Alexios I Komnenos, who had seized the Byzantine throne just 2 years earlier through the time-honored method of military rebellion. He had marched on Constantinople, overthrown the previous emperor, and installed himself on the most powerful seat in the Christian world. So Anna entered a household where the concept of overthrowing the current ruler was not some distant abstraction whispered about in alleyways. It was the family origin story. It was how dinner got paid for. Constantinople in the late 11th century was a city that made every other city in Christendom look like a farm with pretensions. Its population dwarfed London and Paris combined. Its libraries held Greek texts that Western Europe had forgotten existed. Its palaces dripped with gold mosaic, and the light inside them moved like something alive, flickering across saints' faces and emperors' robes until the walls themselves seemed to be watching. The court ceremonial was elaborate enough to qualify as performance art, every gesture calibrated, every title layered with meaning. And underneath all that beauty, all that scholarship, all that silk, ran a current of political violence so constant it was practically ambient noise. palace coups in Byzantium were not rare disruptions of order. They were the order. Into this glittering, treacherous world, Anna was not merely born. She was positioned. As an infant, she was betrothed to Constantine Ducas, the son of the previous emperor, a match designed to fuse the old dynasty's legitimacy with the new one's military power. The arrangement made Anna the heir presumptive. She was literally being raised to rule. Every lesson, every ceremony, every diplomatic introduction was preparation for the throne that was, by all available evidence, supposed to be hers. The mosaics watched. The incense burned. And somewhere in the labyrinth of the great palace, the future was already beginning to change its mind. Anna's education was extraordinary even by Byzantine standards, and Byzantine standards were already enough to make the rest of medieval Europe look like it was still working on the alphabet. She studied Homer, Aristotle, Plato, Euclid. She studied rhetoric, medicine, theology, and military history. In Western Europe at this time, a noblewoman who could read was considered accomplished. Anna was parsing Aristotelian logic and Euclidean geometry before she was old enough to be bored by either, which, to her credit, she apparently never was. She was intellectually ferocious, and she knew it. Her later writing does not bother with false modesty. It does not shuffle its feet and say, "Oh, I am merely a humble woman with a few scattered thoughts." Anna writes like someone who has read everything, understood most of it, and is mildly offended by the rest. The classical Greek rhetorical tradition she absorbed was not some dusty academic exercise. It was a living, continuous intellectual lineage stretching back to ancient Athens, a thread of thought and argument and precision that Byzantium had preserved while Western Europe misplaced it for the better part of a millennium. Anna did not simply receive this tradition. She sharpened it into something she could use. And she would need it. Because the future she had been built for was quietly collapsing. Her fiancé, Constantine Ducas, died when she was still a teenager. The betrothal that had made her the designated heir dissolved overnight, like sugar in hot water, leaving nothing behind but the memory of sweetness and a suddenly uncertain political position. Anna was married instead to Nikephoros Bryennios, a capable nobleman and historian, but the match carried none of the dynastic weight of her first arrangement. Then came the real blow. Her brother John was born. A son. A male heir. And in the calculus of Byzantine succession, a son outranked a brilliant daughter with Aristotle memorized every single time. The throne Anna had been raised to expect, educated to occupy, trained in every discipline to deserve, began sliding sideways. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just slowly, steadily, like a continent drifting. She could feel the distance growing, and there was absolutely nothing her command of Euclidean geometry could do about it. In 1096, the First Crusade arrived at Constantinople's doorstep, and from the Byzantine perspective, the experience was less holy war and more natural disaster wearing a cross. Anna was 13 or 14, old enough to watch, to listen, and to remember with the kind of precision that would later make historians grateful she had functioning eyes. Tens of thousands of Western European soldiers appeared outside the walls of Constantinople, expecting the Byzantine emperor to feed them, supply them, and shuttle them across the Bosporus to the Holy Land. Some of these armies were organized, led by genuine military commanders. Others were barely controlled mobs of pilgrims and opportunists who had walked across Europe on faith and fumes and were now very hungry and standing in someone else's capital. The smell alone must have been remarkable. Thousands of soldiers who had marched for months through the Balkans, unwashed in any meaningful sense, armored in leather and mail and accumulated grime, packed into encampments outside a city famous for its bathhouses. The cultural collision was not subtle. The Byzantines were heirs to Rome, educated in Greek, sophisticated in theology, meticulous in diplomacy. The Crusaders, to Byzantine eyes, were loud, doctrinally confused, and possessed of a confidence that bore no obvious relationship to their level of civilization. They prayed fervently, and they smelled terrible, and they were absolutely everywhere. Anna's father Alexios handled the crisis with the careful brilliance of a man diffusing a bomb while smiling. He extracted oaths of loyalty from Crusader leaders, promising them supplies and support in exchange for agreements that any territory recovered would be returned to the empire. He fed armies that could have eaten Constantinople hollow. He flattered warlords whose table manners would have horrified a provincial innkeeper. And he got them across the Bosporus before they could turn their restless, heavily armed energy on his own city. It was the diplomatic performance of the century, conducted under conditions that would have made lesser statesmen weep into their silk. Anna watched all of it. She took notes, mental or otherwise, with the focus of someone who understood that what she was witnessing was not just a crisis. It was history. And history, she was already beginning to sense, belonged to the people who wrote it down. Of all the Crusader lords who passed through Constantinople, one figure burned himself into Anna's memory so thoroughly that she would produce, decades later, one of the finest character portraits in all of medieval literature. His name was Bohemond of Taranto, and Anna both loathed and admired him with an intensity that practically crackles off the page. Bohemond was a Norman warlord, the son of Robert Guiscard, who had already invaded Byzantine territory in the 1080s. He was not arriving at Constantinople as a pilgrim who happened to carry a sword. He was arriving as a predator who happened to carry a cross. Anna knew this. Her father knew this. Bohemond almost certainly knew that they knew this and smiled about it. Anna's physical description of Bohemond is unlike anything else in Crusader-era writing. She describes his towering height, his broad shoulders, his pale skin, his close-cropped hair. She notes the way he carried himself, a posture that communicated menace as naturally as other men communicated boredom. She observes his laugh, which she characterizes as something that made other people uneasy rather than amused. And then, with visible irritation at her own honesty, she admits he was handsome. Not generically attractive. Specifically, magnetically, dangerously handsome, in a way that clearly annoyed her as a historian, a patriot, and possibly as a woman who resented finding anything appealing about a man she regarded as a civilizational threat. This is what makes the portrait extraordinary. A lesser writer would have simply demonized him. A propagandist would have made him ugly, stupid, brutish. Anna makes him beautiful and terrifying, charismatic and calculating, admirable and existentially dangerous, all in the same breath. She holds contradictions in a single paragraph without flinching, and the result is a character so vivid he feels more real than figures described by people who actually liked him. Bohemond would go on to carve out the Principality of Antioch for himself, breaking every oath he made to Alexios. Anna saw it coming. She wrote it down with the grim satisfaction of someone who had been right about a man and wished, deeply, that she hadn't been. She could see through people. That was the gift. It was also eventually going to be the curse. Alexios I died in 1118, after 37 years on the throne. He had survived Norman invasions, Crusader crises, Pecheneg wars, palace intrigues, and a medical condition Anna herself describes in clinical detail that suggests she inherited her mother's interest in medicine, along with her father's interest in power. He died, by Anna's account, as he had lived, with people maneuvering around him even as the breath left his body. Anna was 35 years old. She was married to Nikephoros Bryennius, a respected general and intellectual. And she believed, with a conviction that appears to have bordered on the religious, that the succession should have passed through her line. Not to her brother John, not to the son who had done nothing particularly extraordinary except be male and be born at a politically convenient moment. To her, or through her, or at the very least to her husband, who had the military credentials and the scholarly temperament, and the advantage of being married to the most qualified person in the empire. What happened next depends on which source is doing the telling, and none of them are entirely trustworthy, which is fitting for a story set in Byzantium. The broad strokes. Anna allegedly conspired to assassinate her brother John II and place Nikephoros on the throne. The plot may have involved poison. It may have involved a more direct approach. The details are murky, which in Byzantine politics usually means the details were horrifying and no one wanted to be specific about them in writing. The coup failed. And here is the detail that later Byzantine historians report with the particular relish of people who enjoy watching a grand plan collapse. Nikephoros Bryennios apparently refused to go through with it. Whether from moral scruple, political cowardice, or a well-developed sense of self-preservation, he declined to seize the throne his wife was handing him. Anna, by all available evidence, never forgave him for this. There are marriages that survive infidelity, financial ruin, exile. It is considerably harder to survive the moment one spouse offers the other an empire and the other says, "No, thank you." John II, to his credit or his calculation or some mixture of both, did not execute his sister. He confiscated her properties. He stripped her of her political influence. And he exiled her from court, sending her to the convent of Ketcheritimony, which her own mother Irene had founded. The woman who had been born in the Purple Room, educated to rule an empire, trained in every art of governance and war, was removed from power permanently. She was approximately 36. She would live another 30 years. And she would need something to do with all that fury. The convent of Ketcheritimony was not a dungeon. It is important to establish this, because the word convent conjures images of bare stone cells and stale bread and women staring at walls in various states of spiritual anguish. Ketcheritimony was a wealthy Byzantine religious house founded by an empress, funded by imperial estates, and equipped with the kind of library that would have made a Western European monastery weep with envy. It had books. It had quiet. It had resources. What it did not have was power or a throne or any route back to either. Anna settled into this gilded cage and did what any brilliant, furious, politically exiled princess with a classical education and a grudge would do. She picked up a pen. Her husband Nikephoros had begun writing a history of Alexios I's reign before his death. He had gotten partway through, producing competent, measured prose that read like exactly what it was. The work of a careful man who did not want to offend anyone. Anna took his unfinished manuscript, looked at what he had written, and apparently decided that competence was not going to be sufficient. She transformed the project entirely. She expanded its scope, sharpened its prose, and infused it with something Nikephoros had never possessed. The perspective of someone who had lost everything and was going to make absolutely certain the world remembered what had been lost. The Alexiad began taking shape in candlelight. The scratch of a reed pen on vellum, the careful formation of Atticizing Greek, each sentence constructed with architectural precision, clauses balanced like columns holding up a portico. The Greek she wrote in was deliberately archaic, modeled on classical Athenian prose, a choice that signaled both her education and her ambition. She was not writing a chronicle. She was writing a monument. Her sources were extraordinary. Decades of first-hand observation at the imperial court. Documents she had access to, or had preserved, or had carried into exile through methods that remain conveniently unclear. Her own memory, which was formidable and selectively devastating. The distant sounds of Constantinople would have drifted over the convent walls, the city she had been born to govern humming along without her, and every paragraph she composed was an answer to that sound. An insistence. A refusal to disappear. The convent gave her silence. She filled it with history. The Alexiad runs to 15 books. 15. That is not a pamphlet, not a memoir dashed off between Vespers and supper. It is a comprehensive military, diplomatic, and political history of the reign of Alexios I Komnenos, covering the years 1081 to 1118, and it is written with the scope of someone who genuinely believed that if the story was going to be told, it might as well be told completely, and by someone who actually understood what had happened. The range of the work is staggering. Norman invasions of the Balkans, the Patronage Wars on the northern frontier, Turkish campaigns in Anatolia, theological disputes that could, and occasionally did, escalate to violence, diplomatic negotiations conducted in rooms thick with silk and suspicion, medical observations detailed enough that modern physicians have attempted retrospective diagnoses based on Anna's descriptions of her father's final illness. And threading through the middle of all of it like an earthquake through a dinner party, the First Crusade. Anna's account of the Crusade is the single most important Byzantine eyewitness perspective that survives. Where Western chroniclers describe noble warriors marching toward Jerusalem in a blaze of holy purpose, Anna describes what those warriors actually looked like from the receiving end, a vast, disorganized, frequently violent mass migration of Western Europeans who arrived expecting hospitality and left a trail of diplomatic wreckage behind them. Her portraits of crusader leaders are unflattering and precise. She catalogs their ignorance of Greek culture, their theological arguments that struck her as crude, their combination of genuine fervor and staggering arrogance. She is not fair. She does not pretend to be. She adores her father with a devotion that occasionally tips into hagiography, and she describes his enemies with the warmth one might reserve for an infestation. But here is the thing about transparent bias. It is vastly more useful than hidden bias. Anna tells the reader exactly where she stands, in every paragraph on every page. She loved her father. She despised the Crusaders. She resented her brother. She mourned her husband, despite also clearly never forgiving him. A historian reading the Alexiad can see every lean, every slant, every place where grief or rage is coloring the narrative and can adjust accordingly. The observations underneath that bias remain extraordinary. She describes troop movements with the specificity of a general. She records diplomatic conversations with the ear of someone who grew up in rooms where words were weapons. She notes the appearance, demeanor, and tactical tendencies of foreign leaders with the precision of someone who was trained from childhood to assess threats. And woven through all 15 books, appearing like a thread of darker silk in an already complex tapestry, is the grief. References to the throne she lost. Allusions to the life she was supposed to have. The careful, controlled sorrow of a woman describing her father's empire from the outside, through convent walls in prose so beautiful it almost conceals how much it cost her to write it. The Alexiad is a political history. It is a family memoir. And it is, unmistakably, an act of revenge conducted entirely in sentences. Anna could not reclaim the throne, so she claimed the story instead. And the story, as it turned out, was the thing that lasted. Anna Komnene died around 1153. She was approximately 70 years old, still in the convent, still exiled from power, still in possession of the most dangerous pen in the Byzantine Empire, even if no one in the palace wanted to admit it. The Alexiad survived her. It was copied, circulated, read, and argued about. Later Byzantine writers sometimes found her self-pity excessive. They found her partisanship too naked, her adoration of her father too unrestrained, her resentment of her brother too obvious. These criticisms were not wrong, exactly. They were just missing the point. Anna had not set out to write a balanced, neutral account of events. She had set out to build something permanent from the ruins of everything she had lost, and balanced neutrality was never going to provide the necessary structural support. Western scholars, for centuries, treated her as a curiosity. A woman historian. How charming, how unusual. Probably unreliable, they said, because she was emotional, because she was biased, because she was a woman writing about military campaigns she could not possibly have understood. This assessment tells us considerably more about the scholars than it does about Anna. The men who dismissed her were, in many cases, relying on Crusader chronicles written by participants who had every reason to exaggerate their own heroism and minimize their own blunders. The idea that these sources were more objective than Anna's simply because they were written by men who had been present at the slaughter rather than a woman who had observed it from a palace window is, to put it gently, not the argument those scholars thought it was. Modern historiography has corrected the error. The Alexiad is now recognized as one of the masterworks of medieval historical writing, an indispensable source for Byzantine Crusader relations, and a work of literary art that stands alongside Thucydides and Procopius in the Greek historical tradition. Anna's portrait of the Crusaders as a disruptive, dangerous, theologically confused military migration that Byzantium survived through intelligence rather than brute force has proven considerably more durable than the Crusaders' own heroic version of events. It turns out that the woman watching from the wall saw more clearly than the men charging through the gates. And this is the modern echo, the part that reaches across 9 centuries and taps the present on the shoulder. History is still mostly written by the people who won. The conquerors, the survivors, the ones who ended up holding the pen because they were the ones left standing. Which makes the accounts written by the brilliant losers, the ones who lost and were furious enough and talented enough to write it all down anyway, genuinely invaluable. They see what the winners cannot see. They record what the winners prefer to forget. They write with a clarity that only comes from having nothing left to protect except the truth, or at least their version of it, which is sometimes closer to the truth than anyone comfortable would like to admit. Anna Komnene was promised an empire. She got a convent and a reed pen and enough vellum to fill 15 books. The empire her brother inherited is gone. The palace where she was born is rubble. The throne she wanted has not existed for over 500 years. The Alexiad is still in print. The pen was enough.